somewhere in the Persian Gulf right now. A Filipino sailor named something like Eduardo is eating breakfast on a ship going nowhere. He has been eating breakfast on that same ship, in that same spot, looking at that same stretch of water for 40 days. His contract was supposed to end 3 weeks ago, and nobody has given him a date when he will see his family again. He is one of 20,000 merchant mariners currently trapped inside the Persian Gulf with no clear timeline for release. Their story is the one getting lost inside the geopolitical noise about ceasefire announcements, Bitcoin tolls, and diplomatic frameworks. Today we are going to talk about the people, not the policy, because the human cost of this crisis is the part that should outrage everyone. We will cover who these sailors are, what their daily reality looks like right now, and who is legally responsible for getting them out. And at the end, we will ask the question nobody in any ceasefire negotiation room has apparently thought to answer publicly. The question is simple when the diplomats finalize a deal. Is there a single line in that agreement about these 20,000 human beings? Let us start with who merchant mariners actually are, because the public image of sailors does not match the reality of this workforce. The global merchant fleet employs approximately 1.9 million seafarers, and the majority come from the Philippines, India, China, and Eastern Europe. These are not military personnel or government employees. They are civilian workers on fixed-term contracts, typically 6 to 9 months at sea. A typical contract has a defined end date, a flight home booked in advance, and a family waiting with a specific arrival date circled on a calendar. When a ship gets trapped in a blockade for 40 days past the end of that contract, every single one of those plans collapses immediately. The average merchant mariner earns between $2,000 and $4,000 per month, depending on rank and vessel type. For a Filipino able seaman, that salary represents the primary income for an entire extended family back home in the provinces. Mortgage payments, school fees, medical bills, and daily household expenses for parents, a spouse, and children all depend on that monthly remittance arriving reliably during a prolonged blockade. Crew pay continues in most contracts, but the inability to rotate crews creates compounding problems that money alone cannot solve. Seafarer mental health under extended confinement is a documented crisis that predates this situation. The COVID-era crew change crisis established that clearly. During COVID, tens of thousands of sailors were stranded at sea for 13, 14, 15 months when ports closed and crew changes became impossible. The psychological literature from that period documents sharply elevated rates of depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation among trapped seafarers worldwide. The current Persian Gulf situation is not as long as the worst COVID cases yet, but 40 days with no end date in sight is not a minor inconvenience. Now let us talk about what daily life actually looks like on one of these anchored ships in the Persian Gulf right now. A large commercial vessel at anchor in hot weather consumes enormous amounts of fuel just to maintain basic habitability through the air conditioning systems. The Persian Gulf in April runs between 30 and 38 degrees Celsius, and below decks without active cooling becomes genuinely dangerous quickly. Fuel consumption while at anchor means ships are burning through their operational reserves without covering any distance or generating any commercial value. Provisions, food, fresh water, medical supplies were loaded at the last port call and were calculated for a normal voyage duration, not an indefinite anchorage. After 40 days, many ships are running low on provisions and must request resupply through channels that require Iranian authorization to operate. Every resupply request is another interaction with the IRGC, another documentation process, another reminder of the complete absence of any autonomy. Internet access on merchant ships is typically provided through satellite connections that are expensive and slow by land-based standards in normal circumstances. For crew members whose only connection to their families is a video call on a slow satellite link, communication is a daily negotiation with bandwidth limits. A sailor trying to explain to his 7-year-old daughter why he is not coming home when he promised is having a conversation no salary compensates for adequately. Now, let us address the question of what routine maintenance work looks like on a vessel that has been sitting at anchor for 40 consecutive days. Ships are designed to move their systems, their engines, their hull coatings, and their mechanical components are engineered for continuous operational cycles. Extended static anchoring causes accelerated hull fouling, increased corrosion in some systems, and mechanical degradation in components that need regular loading cycles. Chief engineers on these vessels are managing maintenance challenges that were never contemplated in the vessel's design specifications or operational manuals. Specific cargo types present additional urgent challenges that get almost no attention in the political coverage of this blockade situation. Bulk carriers with grain cargo face spoilage risks if temperature and humidity inside the holds cannot be properly managed over extended periods. Chemical tankers carrying time-sensitive cargo require active temperature management and regular safety monitoring that consumes crew time and operational resources. Some vessels may be carrying perishable or degrading cargo that becomes commercially worthless, hazardous, or both the longer the blockade continues. The legal and insurance implications of cargo degradation during a force majeure blockade situation will occupy maritime lawyers for years after this ends. Now let us talk about the question of legal responsibility, because this is where the situation becomes genuinely disturbing from a human rights standpoint. Under the Maritime Labor Convention of 2006, ship owners have specific legal obligations to protect seafarer welfare, repatriate crew, and provide medical care. Those obligations exist under normal circumstances. The convention does not provide a clear framework for government-imposed blockades of this specific type. The flags state the country under whose flag a ship is registered has theoretical jurisdiction over crew welfare aboard vessels flying its flag. But flag states in the modern shipping industry are frequently small nations like Panama, Liberia, or the Marshall Islands, chosen primarily for regulatory convenience. Panama is not going to send its navy to extract crew members from a blockaded vessel in the Persian Gulf on behalf of a Filipino sailor. The nationality of the crew members creates additional responsibility for their governments, the Philippines, India, and others whose citizens are trapped on these vessels. The Philippine government has approximately 400,000 seafarers working globally at any given time, and they are the single largest maritime workforce nationality in the world. Filipino remittances from seafarers represent approximately $7 billion per year flowing into the Philippine economy. This crisis is a national economic event for Manila. Yet in every press conference about the Iran-U.S. ceasefire, the 20,000 trapped sailors receive at most a passing mention if they are mentioned at all. The International Transport Workers Federation has been raising the alarm about crew welfare since week one of this blockade and receiving limited political traction. The ITF represents about 700,000 seafarers globally and has formal observer status in multiple international maritime bodies that are currently doing very little here. The International Maritime Organization, the UN body responsible for shipping safety standards, has issued statements of concern and requested access that Iran has largely ignored. There is no international enforcement mechanism that can compel Iran to allow crew changes, provide provisions, or release vessels from a self-declared security zone. The legal architecture for protecting seafarers in peacetime maritime incidents is genuinely robust for government-imposed blockades. It is essentially absent. This gap in international law is not an accident. It reflects the assumption that nation-states would not routinely use civilian sailors as geopolitical leverage. That assumption has now been proven wrong, and the international maritime legal community will need to grapple with this precedent once the immediate crisis resolves. Let us now look at the specific human demographics trapped in the Gulf, because the numbers tell a story about who bears the cost of this crisis. Approximately 1,000 ships are currently anchored in the Persian Gulf, with an average crew size of 20 to 25 people per vessel. That gives us the 20,000 figure. But the national breakdown is where the human story becomes geographically specific and politically relevant. Approximately 30 to 35% of the trapped crew members are Filipino, representing 6,000 to 7,000 individual Filipino nationals. Indian seafarers represent another 20 to 25%, 4,000 to 5,000 Indian nationals currently living in a floating diplomatic limbo. Chinese, Ukrainian, Russian, Indonesian, and European crew members make up the remainder in proportions that reflect the global nature of the maritime workforce. The presence of Ukrainian and Russian crew members on the same vessels, in some cases on the same ships, adds another layer of human complexity to the situation. The international shipping industry has long operated on the principle that professional maritime identity transcends political nationality divisions aboard working vessels. Whether that principle holds under 40-plus days of confinement, with no end date and geopolitical tension on every radio frequency, is an open question. Now let us look at the specific vessels and cargo types that add urgency to the human question, beyond the standard crew welfare considerations. Among the 1,000 trapped ships are LNG carriers, liquefied natural gas vessels, operating at cryogenic temperatures with enormous explosive potential. An LNG carrier at anchor in hot Gulf conditions with a full cargo load is a vessel that requires continuous active management by a trained and alert crew. Crew fatigue from 40 days of heightened vigilance on a high-risk vessel is not a minor operational consideration. It is a genuine safety emergency in progress. Chemical tanker crews face similar elevated risk profiles during extended anchorage, with cargo monitoring requirements that do not decrease simply because the ship is stationary. The longer this blockade continues, the more the safety margin on these high-risk vessels erodes as crew fatigue. Stress and uncertainty accumulate. A single incident on an LNG carrier or chemical tanker in a crowded anchorage would create a catastrophe that dwarfs the current humanitarian situation in scale. This is the safety argument for prioritizing crew relief and vessel movement that should be resonating in every diplomatic conversation about this crisis. Let us now talk about the specific contractual and financial situation these seafarers are facing, because the economic dimension is also deeply unjust. Most seafarer contracts include a force majeure provision that technically allows ship owners to extend contracts during events outside their control. An Iranian government blockade almost certainly qualifies as a force majeure event, which means owners can extend contracts without additional compensation in most cases. The sailor who was supposed to go home 3 weeks ago may receive his regular monthly salary, but has no legal claim for the extended confinement itself. Non-refundable airline tickets purchased for crew change flights are forfeit, and replacement flights upon eventual release must be purchased at current market rates. Medical appointments, family events, educational enrollments, and legal matters that required the seafarer's physical presence have been missed without remedy or compensation. The psychological literature on involuntary confinement is clear that loss of autonomy and unpredictable release dates are among the most damaging elements of the experience. Not knowing when this ends is in some ways more psychologically damaging than knowing it will be. Long uncertainty compounds distress in ways that duration does not fully explain. Now let us address the political invisibility of these 20,000 people, because it is genuinely remarkable how absent they are from the official narrative. The ceasefire announcement on April 7th contained specific language about commercial shipping resumption, oil market stability, and transit protocol frameworks. It contained no specific language about crew change rights, seafarer repatriation timelines, or guaranteed access for provisions and medical supply vessels. The 20,000 human beings whose lives are most directly affected by the Hormuz situation were essentially absent from the text that was supposed to resolve it. This reflects a structural reality about how geopolitical negotiations work. They are conducted by governments on behalf of national interests, not individual workers. The national interest framing covers oil markets, shipping lane access, military posture, and economic leverage. It does not naturally cover Filipino able seamen. The International Labor Organization estimates that over half the world's seafarers come from nations with limited geopolitical leverage in any U.S.-Iran negotiation. The Philippines, India, Indonesia, Ukraine. These nations have enormous stakes in the welfare of their trapped citizens, but limited seats at the negotiating table. This is the fundamental injustice at the center of the human story. The people paying the highest personal price have the least political voice in the resolution. Let us look at historical precedents for how trapped civilian mariners have been handled in previous geopolitical confrontations. Because context matters here. During the Iran-Iraq war tanker war phase from 1984 to 1988, numerous commercial vessels were attacked and crews killed or injured in the Persian Gulf. The international response eventually included Operation Earnest Will, in which the U.S. Navy directly escorted reflagged Kuwaiti tankers through contested waters. That operation was triggered specifically by the ongoing threat to neutral commercial shipping and the human costs being imposed on civilian maritime workers. The current situation has not yet produced the level of violence that triggered Operation Earnest Will, but the structural parallels are clear and worth examining. During the COVID crew change crisis of 2020 and 2021, the ITF and IMO eventually secured agreements with multiple governments for humanitarian crew change corridors. Those corridors were achieved through sustained international pressure, media attention, and the moral clarity of the humanitarian argument being made publicly. The lesson from both historical precedents is that seafarer welfare gains political traction only when it receives sustained and specific public attention over time. Right now, that sustained and specific public attention is not happening, and the 20,000 trapped sailors are paying the price of that invisibility. Here is what a minimally adequate response to the human dimension of this crisis would look like in concrete, practical terms. First, any ceasefire agreement must include specific language guaranteeing humanitarian access for crew change vessels, medical ships, and provision resupply operations. Second, a priority transit list for vessels with crew members who have exceeded their contractual end dates must be established and enforced by international monitors. Third, the IMO and ITF must be granted verified access to assess seafarer welfare conditions aboard anchored vessels in the Persian Gulf immediately. Fourth, the flag states of trapped vessels must formally request emergency consular access for their nationals aboard affected ships through diplomatic channels. Fifth, the U.S. Navy and allied naval forces should establish a humanitarian corridor specifically for crew change operations, separate from the commercial transit question. None of these steps requires resolving the full political question about Iranian control of the strait. They are humanitarian measures independent of the geopolitical settlement. The failure to separate the humanitarian question from the political question is itself a choice, and it is a choice that harms 20,000 people every single day it continues. Now let us talk about the families, because they are the invisible second tier of this crisis, and their situation is also not being discussed adequately. Approximately 20,000 sailors times an average of 3 to 4 family dependents equals 60 to 80,000 people directly affected by this blockade. In the Philippines alone, entire communities in seafarer-sending provinces like Cebu, Iloilo, and Batangas have multiple family members trapped aboard Gulf vessels. The Philippine Overseas Employment Administration, which monitors Filipino workers abroad, has issued welfare bulletins but has no mechanism to expedite repatriation. Indian shipping families in port cities like Mumbai and Chennai are in contact with crews through expensive satellite calls and following every news update obsessively. The emotional labor of waiting for someone to come home when you do not know when that will be is a form of suffering that does not appear in economic damage assessments. Children asking when their father is coming home is a question that no ceasefire press release and no diplomatic breakthrough fully answers in the moment it is asked. Let us end by returning to Eduardo, or whatever his actual name is, because he represents everyone whose face is not in any of the briefing rooms. He did not choose to be in the Persian Gulf during an international crisis. He was doing his job, which is moving the world's goods from place to place. The global economy that most of us benefit from every day depends entirely on people like Eduardo being willing to spend months away from home at sea. When we talk about oil prices and supply chains and geopolitical leverage, we are talking about the abstract commercial value of what Eduardo carries on his ship. When we talk about 20,000 merchant mariners trapped in the Persian Gulf, we should be talking about Eduardo specifically, not just the shipping industry generally. The most important line in any ceasefire agreement that comes out of these negotiations is the one nobody has written, yet the one about getting him home. Not after the oil starts flowing, not after the political framework is finalized, not as a secondary humanitarian consideration once the economic questions are settled. Getting him home should be the first line, the loudest demand, and the clearest measure of whether any diplomatic agreement is actually adequate. The Strait of Hormuz will eventually reopen economic gravity, and global pressure make that outcome near certain over a long enough time horizon. The question is whether 20,000 ordinary workers will be treated as human beings with rights during the process or as background variables in someone else's negotiation. Share this video, because the political attention that these sailors need will only materialize if enough people understand that they exist and that they are waiting. Every view and every share on a story like this is a small contribution to the sustained public attention that actually moves political priorities in practice. Subscribe and turn on notifications for updates on the crew welfare situation. Specifically, we will cover it separately from the geopolitical resolution when it develops. Eduardo has been at sea for 40 days past his contract end date, and he deserves at least this much: that someone somewhere is counting and telling his story.